She had not intended to save him. She had only meant to feed herself. The man appeared at the edge of her kitchen garden on the last morning of October, when the frost had finally relented enough to allow her fingers to close properly around a turnip. Cecily Marsden did not scream. She had learned, in the 3 years since her husband's death, that screaming used energy she could not spare. The man was on his knees in the dried grass along the stone wall, and he was not moving in the way a man who had recently fallen moved. He was still in the way that animals went still when they had decided it was finished. His coat was fine wool, once. The mud had done considerable work to it. She stood with the turnip in her hand and looked at him for a count of 10. Then, she said, "You are breathing." It was not a question. His side rose and fell in shallow pulls, and the condensation of each exhale vanished quickly into the cold air. He had dark hair matted against a jaw like carved stone, and his eyes, when they opened, were a gray so pale it read as winter sky through glass. They focused on her without expression. Not gratitude, not fear, something more particular than either. "You will come inside," she said. She did not wait to see whether he obeyed. She turned and walked back through the kitchen door, because she knew, in the specific way, that a woman who had managed her own survival for 3 years came to know things that he would follow. A man with that quality of stillness always chose to continue. If you have ever watched someone decide to live, you know the exact weight of that pause. "Stay close." He followed. His name, he told her between 2 slow spoonfuls of the broth she set before him, was Hadley. Nothing more. She did not press. In this village, men who appeared out of the October fields without introductions were usually in some difficulty with a creditor, and that was the concern of the creditor, not of the woman warming the broth. She gave him the bread she had meant for her own supper. She refilled the bowl twice. She noted that his hands, wrapped around the cup she placed near him, were not soft hands. There was work in the knuckles. There were also 3 rings on a cord inside his shirt, which she caught a glimpse of when the neck of his garment fell open. But she did not ask about those either. He ate with the concentrated quiet of a man who had been without food for a length of time that embarrassed him. She looked away during the worst of it, pretending to check the state of the fire, because dignity was a thing a person maintained for themselves, and one did not assist in stripping it. "Mrs. Marsden," she said, when he looked up. It was the only introduction she offered. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You live alone here." It was not a question either. "I manage," she said. The word manage carried in it the particular weight of widows in the 3rd year of their independence, carrying the weight of 100 small competencies assembled in the absence of help, and a pride that had grown from necessity until it was indistinguishable from character. The cottage sat at the far eastern boundary of the Vellecourt estate, on a 1/4 acre her husband Edmund had held on a long lease that his death had not terminated. The nearest village was 4 miles by the road and 2½ by the field path, which was the path Cecily used when her shoes were sound enough. Her nearest neighbor was old Mrs. Prentice, who was nearly blind and kept geese. The Vellecourt great house was visible, on clear days, as a pale smear above the tree line 3 miles to the north, and Cecily had never been invited inside it, and had no expectation of being so. The estate had a steward, a Mr. Aldous Fenn, who collected her quarterly rent in person, with the expression of a man performing a distasteful task, and who had twice in the past 18 months hinted that the terms of the Marsden lease were under review. She did not know on that October morning that the man drinking her broth was Miles Vellecourt, the 4th Earl of Wren, who had been riding alone since the previous day, and whose horse had thrown him at the stream crossing 2 fields east. She did not know that he owned every acre she walked. He slept in the chair by the fire that night, which she allowed because she had no reason not to, and the temperature had dropped to something serious by full dark. She gave him her husband's old blanket, which was thick and slightly moth-eaten, and smelled of cedar from the chest. In the morning she found he had fed the fire without being asked, and had fetched in more wood from the stack outside, and had done so quietly enough that she had not woken. She found 2 shillings on the table beside the bread. She stood looking at the coins for rather longer than the sum warranted. Then she pocketed them, because she was a practical woman, and went to see if the geese at Mrs. Prentice's had laid. He was still there when she came back. She did not say he could stay. She did not say he could not. There was a particular grammar available to women who managed alone, in which the continuation of a situation was neither welcome nor refusal, but simply the acknowledgement that the situation had not yet resolved itself. She set water to heat and began to peel the turnips. He sat down without being invited and began to do the same with the second knife she had not offered, as if the work were simply there and he intended to do it. "You have people expecting you," she said. "Yes," he said. "You have not sent word." "No." She peeled in silence for a moment, the peelings curled to the table in long pale strips. "There is paper," she said, "and ink. Sufficient for a letter, if you require it." He was quiet long enough that she glanced at him. He was looking at the turnip in his hand with an expression she could not read, something between deliberation and the careful suppression of something more complicated. "Not yet," he said. She did not ask why. A man who did not want to be found had his reasons. She had her own categories of things she did not explain to strangers. The dismissive label reached her on the fourth day, in the form of Mrs. Prentice's granddaughter Nell, who was 11 and incurably curious, and who brought the eggs herself, rather than wait for Cecily to come and collect them. Nell arrived at the door and looked at Hadley, who was splitting wood in the yard with the economical movements of a man who had done it before, and said, loudly enough for the yard to hear, "Gran says he is one of those wandering men who have no one to answer for them." She announced this with the directness of children who have not yet learned to distinguish between information and verdict. Cecily thanked her for the eggs and closed the door. He had heard. She knew this by the slight check in the rhythm of the axe, a pause no longer than a breath, before the steady work resumed. She thought, watching the eggs in her hand, that she did not believe it. A man who fed the fire unprompted and peeled turnips without being asked and placed coins on a table, rather than pocketing. What he found was not a man with no one to answer for him. He was a man temporarily removed from whoever expected his accounting. Those were different things. The difference mattered. He stayed 5 days. On the 5th morning she came downstairs to find him standing at the window with his coat on, and his aspect altered back to something more formal, something he had laid aside during the interlude, and was now reassuming with the visible deliberateness of a man returning to a role. He looked different. She had not noticed, during the days of broth and wood-splitting, and the long quiet evenings by the fire with Edmund's book of county history open between them, how much space he occupied when he occupied it on purpose. He was taller than she had registered. The coat, now dried and brushed, was of a quality that recalibrated everything. "I will send something," he said. "You owe me nothing," she said. "You left sufficient coin." Something shifted behind his eyes. "Nevertheless," he said. He left by the field path, heading north. She watched him until the tree line took him, and then she went inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment, noting that the fire was already laid for the morning, and that the wood stack outside was higher than it had been when he arrived, and that her copy of the county history had a leaf pressed inside it at the page about the settlement of the Vellecourt estate in the year of the previous king's coronation, which she was nearly certain had not been there before. She opened the book. The pressed leaf was from the oak near the stream crossing. She did not know why this made her chest feel tight. She would learn soon enough that it should have felt something else entirely. The letter from Mr. Fenn arrived 3 weeks later, on a gray Tuesday in November. It was written in the steward's cramped administrative hand on estate stationery, and it informed Mrs. Cecily Marsden that the terms of her late husband's lease would not be renewed upon their expiration at Christmas, and that she was expected to quit the cottage by the 28th of December. The grounds cited were general, a restructuring of estate holdings. The tone was careful and final. There was no appeal mechanism suggested. She read it twice at the table, her hands flat on either side of the paper to keep them from shaking. Then she folded it precisely and placed it beneath the county history on the shelf, because she had learned that placing a terrible thing precisely was the first act of managing it. She had 30 shillings saved. The cottage held 12 years of her life. The quarter-acre kitchen garden was the reason she had eaten through 3 winters without depending on anyone's charity. She knew the field paths for 2 miles in every direction, and the names of every family who farmed within walking distance, and the particular quality of light in this kitchen in the early morning, which was gold and particular, and not replicable by any other room she had ever stood in. She sat down and began to think. What she did not permit herself to think, not yet, was the name she had not known to attach to the man who had slept in her chair and eaten her bread, and pressed an oak leaf between the pages of her history of his own estate. The village assembly that brought her the name happened on the following Thursday, when Mrs. Bramwich, who was the vicar's wife and constitutionally unable to let information rest, arrived with a jar of preserves and an air of contained urgency. She came inside and sat down and delivered her information in the practiced way of women who have rehearsed their opening. The gentleman who had been found wandering on the Velacourt land 3 weeks prior was none other than Lord Velacourt himself. Miles Velacourt, the Earl of Wren, who had been absent from the great house for 6 days, and had returned looking like a man who had spent them in a cattle byre. His steward, Mr. Fenn, had been wild with agitation. Lord Velacourt had said nothing to account for his time, other than that he had been helped by a person of good character in the eastern fields. Mrs. Bramwich watched Cecily's face during this recitation with an alertness that suggested she had been sent specifically to observe the reaction. Cecily kept her face entirely still. She poured the tea. She thanked Mrs. Bramwich for the preserves which were plum and which she did not deserve. She let the conversation run until it exhausted itself, and then she said she had work in the garden and showed her visitor out with perfect courtesy. She stood in the closed kitchen for a full minute after the door shut. He had known. He had known from the moment she said her name. From the moment he saw the lease document she had left on the table the second morning without thinking, from perhaps the moment he arrived at the wall of her garden, and the quality of her soil told him that here was a woman who had worked this ground. For years, he had eaten her bread and split her wood and accepted her hospitality, and he had known, and he had said nothing. And then he had gone back to his house 3 miles north, and had his steward send a letter telling her she was finished here. The cold of that arrived in her slowly. It settled in the way that deep cold settled, not all at once. She took the letter out from under the history and read it a third time. Then she sat down and wrote a reply. She wrote with the precision of a woman who had conducted her own correspondence for 3 years, and had learned that precision was the armor available to those without rank. She stated that she intended to present herself at the great house of Velacourt on the following Monday to speak with Lord Velacourt directly regarding the terms of the proposed eviction, as she believed a matter of this nature warranted a conversation rather than a letter delivered unilaterally. She signed it Mrs. Marsden and addressed it to the Earl of Wren. She walked to the village herself that afternoon in the cold and put it in the post. Then she went home and fed the fire and sat in the chair where he had slept, and did not permit herself to think about the oak leaf pressed between the pages of the history until the fire had burned down to coals. A woman with nothing left to lose is a very particular kind of woman. You will see what she does with it. She wore her best dress on Monday. It was not a fine dress. It was the deep blue wool she had bought in the second year of her widowhood, when it became clear she would need something serviceable for occasions, and it had done its work since then with the honest reliability of a thing made to last rather than to please. Her hair was dressed as well as she could manage it alone, which was precisely because she had always been precise. She walked the 3 miles by the field path because her shoes were sound and the morning was dry, and she arrived at the gates of the Velacourt great house at the appointed hour with color in her face, from the cold and mud no higher than her ankle. The housekeeper who admitted her was Mrs. Clive, a large composed woman who conveyed, in the 2 minutes of the entrance hall, that she knew exactly who Mrs. Marsden was, and what she had come for, and that Lord Velacourt had been informed and had not refused the appointment. This last piece of information was delivered as neutral fact, but Cecily heard in it the faint register of something Mrs. Clive was not going to name. She was shown to a small study off the main corridor. It was not the grand receiving room, which was perhaps a statement. She sat in the chair she was offered and placed her hands in her lap and looked at the fire, which was well built and gave a good heat, and waited. He entered 4 minutes later. She stood because she had been raised to stand and faced him, because she had been raised to look at the things that frightened her directly. He was Lord Velacourt in this room in a way he had not been Hadley in her kitchen. The same jaw, the same winter-gray eyes, the same quality of stillness. The coat was of impeccable cut. He stopped just inside the door and looked at her, and she saw, with a precision that surprised her, that he was deciding how to begin. She decided for him. "You knew," she said, "when you were in my cottage. You knew who you were and what land you owned, and you said nothing." He said, "Yes." The single syllable took some courage. She acknowledged it privately. "And now your steward has sent me notice to quit," she said. "I am aware." He moved to the desk, not away from her. and stood beside it with his hands at his sides. "Sit down." "I prefer to stand," she said. For this conversation, the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. Something preceding a smile briefly visible and then not. "You prefer to stand," he repeated, as if storing the information. "Very well." He said nothing for a moment. The fire was the only sound. Then he said, "Fenn sent that letter on standing instructions. Instructions I had not reviewed in some time. I did not authorize the specific notice." She looked at him. "That is a distinction that does not prevent me from losing my home by Christmas." "No," he said, "it is not." She held his gaze. He held hers. There was a quality of examination to it that she had not experienced from a man in quite this way, as if he were looking at a specific thing, rather than past her toward a general impression of the category she occupied. "The lease is valid," she said. "Edmund paid every quarter. I have paid every quarter since. The terms specify renewal unless there is material breach. I have not breached anything." "I know," he said. The word sat between them with an odd gravity. "Then I cannot understand," she said, "why I am here rather than in receipt of a corrected letter." He looked at the desk for a moment, then he looked back at her. "Because," he said, and stopped. She waited. "Because I wanted to see you again," he said, "and I found I had no mechanism for it." The candor of this was so unexpected that she had no immediate answer. She had prepared for deflection, for legal argument, for the particular condescension of men who mistake administration for authority. She had not prepared for honesty. "That is a very strange way to arrange a meeting," she said at last. "Yes," he said, "it was." The warmth at the base of her throat was the body's small mutiny, the one she had been managing since she walked through his door and found him. Already there, already turning to face her, already knowing her name. She looked away, toward the fire. The fire was steadier than she was, at present. He moved a step toward her. She did not step back. "I would like to explain," he said, "about the lease." "Please," she said. He was not. She came to understand over the following 20 minutes a cold man. He was a careful one, which was not the same thing, and the care had its source in a particular grief she learned only gradually as he sat at the desk, and she eventually, reluctantly, took the chair, and the conversation that had begun as a confrontation slowly became something else. His wife had died 4 years ago in childbed, the infant not surviving either. He had ridden out the previous October because the anniversary of her death had a way of making the great house feel insufficient to contain him, and he had been riding without attention to direction or weather. And the stream crossing had been iced at the edges, and his horse, a sensible animal named Byron, had declined the attempt more forcefully than he anticipated. He told her about the portrait of his wife that still hung in the upstairs study, and the small enameled locket on the cord with the rings, which had been hers. He told her these things in the measured, uninflected manner of a man who had carried them alone for 4 years, and found that they could be said aloud without destroying him, which was itself apparently a discovery. His hands lay flat on the desk while he spoke. She watched them because she had learned to trust hands. She understood, by the time he finished, that she had been the first person he had told since the year it happened. She understood also that the silence in her kitchen those 5 days, the long evenings with the county history open between them and the fire doing its work, had been a specific kind of rest he had not known he required. She thought of Edmund, who had been a good man, quiet and reliable, and who had left her nothing but the lease and the garden, and the knowledge that she was capable of surviving without assistance. She had loved him in the moderate, affectionate way of a suitable marriage. She had not imagined, after he died, that the body was capable of this other thing, this particular electric attention. She was aware of exactly where Lord Vellacourt was in the room at every moment. She had been so since she arrived. The letter reached her the following week in Mr. Fenn's hand, but bearing Lord Vellacourt's seal, a corrected notice, retracting the eviction, restating the lease's validity through its full term, and attaching a new offer of terms that would extend the arrangement by 7 years at the existing rate. At the bottom, in a hand she did not recognize as administrative, were 4 words, not signed, not formally addressed, only, "Come to the hall." She pressed this letter between the pages of the county history, on the page where the oak leaf already lived, and sat for quite a long time looking at nothing. She went to the hall the following Friday, because she was a practical woman, and because the alternative was to spend the winter wondering what she had declined. It was not a single visit. It was not a single conversation. It became, across the cold weeks of November and the first dark weeks of December, A series of evenings by a fire that was larger than the one in her kitchen, and in rooms that were far better furnished than anything she had ever occupied, in the company of a man who asked her opinion of things with a directness that she found, initially, disorienting, and then, by increments, restorative. He asked about the garden, specifically about the methods she had developed for managing the clay soil in the eastern quarter, and the way she had trained the beans along the stone wall. He asked as someone who intended to know, not as someone passing a gracious evening. She answered in kind. She had never been asked, not by anyone in 3 years, as if her knowledge were a resource worth consulting rather than a curious accomplishment for a widow with too much time. The something that was growing between them was visible to Mrs. Clive, who did not mention it, but began setting a place for Mrs. Marsden at supper without being asked, and who had a way of arranging the room before Cecily arrived that suggested she had been watching the evenings unfold with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had seen the great house go dark and was relieved to see it lit again. It was visible to Nell, who told her grandmother, who told Mrs. Bramwich, who told the village, which arrived at its verdict within a fortnight. The verdict was delivered to Cecily directly by Lady Hargrove, who was a cousin of the Velacourt family, and who appeared at Lord Velacourt's hall one December afternoon with the specific purposeful air of a woman who has appointed herself the conservator of an estate's interests. Lady Hargrove was 60, formidably dressed, and possessed of the particular kind of social confidence that had never been seriously tested. She found Cecily in the downstairs parlor with a book, which she appeared to regard as evidence of something. "A charming picture," Lady Hargrove said, and her tone made charming into a careful diminishment. "Though I imagine a woman in Mrs. Marsden's position finds any warm room a luxury." She sat down without being invited and arranged her skirts. "A poor widow with a tenant garden is not what one looks for at Velacourt." Cecily closed her book. She looked at Lady Hargrove steadily. "You have been very kind to my nephew during his recent difficulties," Lady Hargrove continued, with the smooth momentum of a woman who had prepared her lines. "It is the sort of charity one naturally admires. One hopes, of course, that it has not been extended under any misapprehension." "What misapprehension do you mean?" Cecily said. Lady Hargrove smiled with the half of her face available for social performances. "Only that a gentleman's gratitude and a gentleman's intention are not always the same thing. A woman who has known the world would not confuse them." Cecily said, "I am not confused about anything." Lady Hargrove's smile did not alter. "No," she said, "I am sure not." She rose. She adjusted her gloves. "I mention it only because there is a Miss Carver, a young woman of family, whom my nephew has been expected to consider for the past 2 seasons, and whose interest in Velacourt has not diminished. It would be a pity for anyone to be inconvenienced." She left Cecily with this information arranged precisely, like a piece of furniture placed to obstruct. Cecily sat in the parlor after she had gone and looked at the fire. She thought about inconvenienced. She thought about expected to consider. She thought about the specific quality of a man who asked about clay soil with the attentions of someone who intended to know. Then she stood and straightened her dress and went to find Mrs. Clive and asked whether Lord Velacourt was in his study. He was. He stood when she entered, which he always did, and she looked at him for a moment across the room and said, "Lady Hargrove has paid a call." Something moved across his face. It was not surprise. "I see," he said. "She mentioned Miss Carver," Cecily said. He crossed the room. Not 3 strides. 6 careful, deliberate ones, and each brought him closer until he was near enough that she could see the cord inside his collar, and know what hung on it, he said, in a voice that was very even. "Miss Carver is Lady Hargrove's notion, not mine." Cecily looked at him. She seemed persuasive. "She is always persuasive," he said. "She persuaded my father into 2 decisions he regretted. I have made it a practice to hear her out, and then do the opposite." The corner of his mouth moved. She does not know this. The warmth that arrived in her chest was not small this time. It had been building for weeks. She had been managing it with the same precision she applied to the clay soil and the bean rows. And it was, she acknowledged now, not successfully managed. She looked at the cord at his collar. She looked at his hands. She looked at his face. "What is it you want?" she said. She meant it as plainly as she said it. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the first real snow of December had begun to fall. Visible through the study window, as a gray softening of the tree line, he said, "I have wanted, since the morning I followed you through a kitchen door and accepted your bread, to have some legitimate reason to stay. He paused. I have found myself willing to manufacture one if necessary. The corrected lease, she said. Yes. And the come to the hall at the bottom of Mr. Fenn's letter, yes. She looked at him. That is a strange courtship, she said. I am a strange man, he said. You fed me turnip soup in October and did not ask my name for 3 days, which suggests you can manage strange. She almost smiled. She kept it contained by a very small margin. What happened next was decided in a room that smelled of wood smoke and old books on a December afternoon with snow beginning outside the window, between a woman who had managed alone for 3 years and a man who had managed alone for 4, neither of them requiring rescue from the other so much as requiring, at last, the specific relief of company that did not ask them to be different from what they were. The Christmas assembly at the hall was Lord Vellacourt's first entertainment in 3 years. Mrs. Clive had been preparing for it for a fortnight, with the contained energy of a woman whose professional purpose had been misdirected, and who was now finally aimed correctly. The rooms were decorated with pine boughs and white candles, and a fire so large in the main parlor that the heat reached the corridor. The county families arrived in their carriages along the newly gridded drive, and among them, inevitably, was Lady Hargrove, with Miss Carver on her arm. Miss Carver being a pleasant-faced young woman of 20, who had the slightly fixed expression of someone who had been told how an evening would go and was attempting to fulfill the description. Cecily arrived on foot, because the field path between her cottage and the hall was only a mile in winter by the shorter route, and because she had worn her good boots and the snow was not deep. She came through the servants' entrance, which Mrs. Clive had left unlocked for her, and was admitted to the hallway already full with arriving guests, and she stood for a moment in her deep blue wool dress, with the snowflakes still melting in her hair, and she watched the assembled county look at her and arrive at their conclusions. Lady Hargrove's conclusion was audible. She said it to the woman beside her in the tone of a woman who wishes to be overheard by a particular party, and what she said was, "A poor widow with a tenant garden here on Christmas Eve. One does wonder at it." 24 faces turned. Some of them knew Cecily from the village. Some of them knew her not at all, only by the summary Lady Hargrove had been distributing for 3 weeks. Lord Vellacourt was on the far side of the room. He had been speaking with 2 gentlemen of the county when she entered, and she had not looked at him, because she had not wanted to ask anything of him with her eyes in a room full of witnesses. She looked at the fire instead. The fire was steady, as fires in his rooms were always steady, because he had learned to build them properly in a kitchen in October. He crossed the room. She heard him before she saw him move, because the particular quality of his silence changed, and the crowd shifted to accommodate his direction. He stopped beside her, not at a social distance, close enough that she could see the cord inside his collar and the faint change in his breathing that she had learned to. "Read over the preceding weeks," he said, in a voice that carried exactly as far as it needed to. "Mrs. Marsden was kind enough to agree to stand with me this evening." Lady Hargrove's intake of breath was not quite silent. He turned to look at her directly, which was the only acknowledgement he gave to the rest of the room. What he said next was short and level and irrevocable. "She has also agreed to be my wife." The room held its breath. Miss Carver's fixed expression completed a very precise internal calculation and settled into something that was, actually, relief. Lady Hargrove's posture lost its authority fraction by fraction, like ice over a river on the first warm day of March, the surface still intact and the thing beneath it completely changed. Cecily looked at him. He was looking at her. His face was very still and his eyes were winter gray, and the cord at his collar was visible above the cravat, and she thought of the leaf pressed in the county history and the 2 shillings on her table, and the word nevertheless, spoken in her kitchen on a November morning. She took his offered hand. His fingers closed around hers with the careful deliberateness of a man who had decided to be exact about this particular thing and was not going to be otherwise. Mrs. Clive, visible through the doorway to the hall, permitted herself one small contained nod of satisfaction. The witnesses who had first heard a poor widow with a tenant garden used as a category of dismissal stood in their good clothes and their good fire warmth and arrived, quietly and without announcement, at a different conclusion. They were married in February when the snowdrops had already come up through the frost along the stone wall of the kitchen garden, which she had asked to keep, and which he had understood without needing it explained. The ceremony was small. In the chapel on the estate grounds, with Mrs. Clive and Nell, and Mrs. Prentice's geese audible at the gate as the wedding party emerged. The county families who had been present at Christmas came, and Lady Hargrove came, and had the grace to say something to Cecily afterward that was less rehearsed than her usual performances and more honest. That evening, in the upstairs study of the great house that was now also her house, Cecily stood at the window and looked out at the 3 miles of field path and frost and the faint dark line of the eastern wall where her kitchen garden waited under its winter cover. Behind her, on the writing desk, the county history lay open to the page about the settlement of the Velacourt estate. Miles had put it there without comment that afternoon, and she had found it when she came upstairs, the oak leaf still pressed inside, the spine cracked to that exact page from long familiar use. She heard him come in. She did not turn around. She felt his stillness in the room. That particular quality she had learned to read as a man who was deciding to speak. He came to stand beside her at the window. His hand found hers on the sill without looking, in the way of a man who has learned where a person is without needing to see. Outside, the fields of the Velacourt estate lay under their February frost, every acre of them quiet and known and white. She had walked every one of them for 3 years. She had walked them alone, in the specific way of a woman who had adjusted her life to the shape of her circumstances, and then, without intending to, had outgrown the adjustment. He said very quietly, "I should have told you." "Yes," she said. He was silent for a moment. The silence was not an absence. It was the kind of silence that carries weight and means to. "In the kitchen," he said, "you looked at me as if I were simply a man." She considered this. "You were a man in my kitchen who needed feeding," she said. "That is what you were." He turned to look at her profile. She kept her eyes on the fields. "No one has looked at me that way in 4 years," he said. "In 4 years and very probably longer." She looked at him then. His face was very close. The cord was inside his collar, and the locket was there, and the memory of his dead wife was in this room, as it ought to be, because it had made him the man who had presided over this house for 4 years and built fires well and kept his word. She turned fully toward him, which was an answer to the thing he had not quite asked. His hand was still on hers on the sill. He did not need to say anything more. Neither did she. The fire in the study hearth burned steadily behind them, and through the window the February fields held their frost, and somewhere on the shelf behind them, the county history lay open to the page she knew by heart, with the oak leaf from the stream crossing still pressed between its pages, patient as a thing that had decided it was exactly where it was supposed to be. Thank you for staying with Cecily until the very end.